Trigger warning. This video discusses sensitive topics such as child abuse and domestic violence. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please seek help and support from trusted authorities or organizations. Title: Breaking the Silence, a young girl's courageous story.
The chipped paint on the ceiling was the first thing Ilara saw every morning. It was a constellation of pale blue against the faded white, not unlike the bruises that bloomed on her skin. She'd learned to trace the patterns, finding a strange comfort in their familiarity. It was a safer world up there, compared to the one that lay below. Her stepfather, Mark, was a storm. He was a thunderclap that shattered the quiet of their small house, a dark cloud that loomed over Ilara's fragile existence. The first time it happened, she was 10. The memory was a jagged shard, lodged deep within her, sharp and painful. He'd grabbed her arm, his fingers leaving angry red welts. He'd hissed at her, calling her names that made her shrink inside herself. She told her mother, of course. Tears streamed down her face as she stammered out the story, showing the fading marks on her arm. But her mother, Sarah, just sighed, her eyes tired and distant. "He was just being firm, Ilara," she'd said, her voice flat. "You must have done something to upset him." The words were like a slap. Ilara's heart crumpled. It wasn't fair. She hadn't done anything, but she learned that day, a brutal lesson, that her truth was invisible to her mother. The beatings continued, escalating over the years. They started with slaps, shoves, and harsh words, morphing into something far more brutal, far more frightening. He'd isolate her, waiting until Sarah was out of the house before unleashing his rage. He called her a liar, a disgrace, a burden. Each blow chipped away at her spirit, leaving her feeling small, broken, and alone. Ilara tried again and again to tell her mother. She'd point to the bruises that flowered on her skin, the cuts that sometimes marked her arms and legs. She'd tried to explain the fear that constantly resided in her chest, the way her stomach clenched whenever she heard his car pull into the driveway. But Sarah remained steadfast in her denial. She'd make excuses for Mark, saying he was stressed at work, or that Ilara was being overly sensitive. "He loves us, Ilara," she'd say, her voice laced with a fragility that Ilara couldn't understand. It was like she was wrapped in a thick fog of denial, unable or unwilling to see the monster she lived with. It was the silence, the unwavering lack of belief, that hurt the most. It was the feeling of being utterly alone, not just in her suffering, but in her truth. She was trapped in a nightmare, and the one person who was supposed to protect her was blind to it all. As the years passed, Ilara became adept at hiding. She wore long sleeves, even in the summer heat. She avoided eye contact with her mother, sensing the discomfort in her gaze. She buried herself in books, creating worlds where she was safe, where her voice was heard.